Hello, this is the Midwest Center, Richard Levito. Welcome to our live stream. Our first live stream for the Midwest Center is coming to you tonight, Sunday on Labor Day weekend, appropriately. And just here to kind of throw a few things out at you, and we're going to see if we can invite and find anybody to come and join us on our YouTube channel. We're excited about having uh, this up and running and our maiden voyage weekend of the Midwest Center's podcast and live stream. Tonight, we're looking to get into the first principles, just the first initial comments. We like to get into talk with, or call it the American Mussolini moment. And of course, whether we make some lighthearted comments about our favorite dictator, a new dictator. America has come into a new era, certainly making America quite great again, just like Mussolini promised to make Italy great again also, just like some Adolf thought he was making Germany great again. And so we have a German individual, the son of a multi-millionaire who never served. He used it, that he had a twisted ankle, so he couldn't go to Vietnam like most billionaires' sons. And he chose to act like a coward during the 60s. When he got to the 70s and 80s, he was partying in Studio 54, which I'm old enough to remember the decadent 70s and 80s. And nothing more decadent than the Studio 54 crowd in New York City. And every celebrity in the world was there, and every artist like Andy Warhol, who was quite twisted. And as they said, even Howard Stern said on his show, there was live orgies in the basement. And Trump was a constant figure there. And he admitted on Howard Stern's show that he saw supermodels engaged in active intercourse in public, and he witnessed it repeatedly. And he liked to go to Studio 54. Now, however, he's supported by the evangelical Christian Zionist movement. He's been forgiven. He's been washed. He's been prayed over. He's been renovated. And this 3-time loser as a husband and is now leading the great American military machine, and he's pumped up America, white men all over this country, to think that they have a great leader, and white women think they have a great leader, a wonderful leader, because he's so powerful and he's so strong and he likes to bully people. A person who's never been to war, never seen what war really does, unlike my father, who was a D-Day veteran, who was a true war hero, like so many of his generation. And maybe my father's passed away long before Donald Trump rose to power, thank God, because he would be sick to his stomach to think a person like this would have risen to the Oval Office and have such a following in this country. Among white people, he has a following. And I say that specifically, even though he received a certain amount of black vote, he received a certain amount of Spanish vote. But we all know that his base is white, and his base is mainly fairly ignorant whites. And when I say ignorant, they are stubbornly refusing to see, even to this day, that this man is a fraud. And the economy is in a free fall. The world has turned away from the United States. People don't even want tourism is down so bad. It's something like $8 to $9 billion worth of tourism is estimated to be lost already since he took the oath of office. Vegas is pretty much barren. They said all summer Canadians have fled Florida, and so many others don't want to come to the United States. He's threatening to pretty much every institution in this country, you can name it, he's threatened it. He's not just threatened it, he's actually taken active steps to undermine them, including Harvard, Columbia, University of Pennsylvania, Ohio State University, Stanford. There isn't a major university in this country that he hasn't threatened over what he calls as the DEI policies, and over the student protests last year, their right to protest Gaza and what's happening with Israel in Gaza, labeling protesters anti-Semitic, encouraging the states to pass laws that would curb freedom of speech, like Ohio has. And all red Republican states like Ohio can't do enough to fall in line with the new Mussolini. Mussolini was an interesting character. He made the trains run on time, as they say. And he was into building big things. He liked big projects. And he organized Italy around a strong image of a man riding in on a white horse. And Trump doesn't have a white horse. He wouldn't know how to ride one. But he rides an escalator down his Trump Tower, and he rides jets and golf carts around. This is our strong, Mussolini figure. And in our day and age, what's disturbing to somebody who is the son of a World War II veteran who fought from D-Day on the beach of Normandy, Omaha Beach, the 29th Division. He went from there after receiving a Purple Heart wound to his head the night of D-Day as he got to the top of the cliffs at Normandy. And he decided to go back to his unit, even though he could have gone home and escaped the rest of the war because of his injury. But he decided to go back and join his unit. He was a chemical mortar battalion sergeant, and he used white phosphorus. He described it later in his life, what it did to the German villages and the German positions that they used it on. And he never forgot the images of what it did and what it was capable of doing. And he fought in the battles of St. Lo, the battles of the Ardennes Forest, the Battle of the Bulge. He was sent there before it started with a directive that write a letter home, you probably won't make it through this. Him and his comrades quickly left the briefing before the commander is even done, he said. So they knew by then, as veterans of the war, that they got there before the Germans, they had a chance of survival, and they did. He was in Bastogne when the Battle of the Bulge opened up. He was waiting for the Germans there at the critical juncture, and it was part of the unit that helped slow down the German progress to allow it to for the U.S. Air Force and the British Air Force to gain an upper hand eventually. And he went on from there, and he said he had a crossing of the Rhine was just as bad as D-Day. And you have to be a veteran to understand those kinds of comments. Everybody talks about the worst day being D-Day or some of the other battles, but he said the crossing of Rhine was equal to all. Hundreds and hundreds of soldiers were killed by machine gun fire crossing the Rhine into Germany, and through mistakes that were made and miscalculations by the U.S. Commanders. But my father was a true World War II veteran, and because he saw war up close and personal, and he lost dear friends in the middle of firefights or nighttime when they were relaxing, people taking his place on the point, and they died in his place. Because he had those experiences, he never came back with an attitude of false patriotism or false sense of pride of what the American military machine can do. Of course, they were proud about having put down Hitler's machine. Of course, they created a whole new era for America, him and his generation, in terms of winning that war on the Western Front, knowing that Russia was critical to winning that war with him as an ally. But he came back with a very different view of war. And anybody who, like him, and his generation, who've been to war, most of them understood that war was nothing planning to put a word to it, like Wu-Tang, nothing to fuck with, unlike Trump. And especially the only time the military machine makes sense to use it is against something as evil as the Nazi SS Germany, the Nazi death machine, and what it did to so many in Europe. And perhaps, as some philosophers said, and even religious theologians have said, it was a moral war. If a war can be moral, World War II is probably one of the few wars of the 20th century that we called moral, because it was against a fascist dictator and a serious evil that was centered in the heart of Europe. So today we have a president who has no understanding of that experience, unlike that generation. He has no experience of the Vietnam generation, even though that's his generation. And he obviously grew up around Vietnam and in the Vietnam era. And it's rather disturbing to think that this guy who lived through the Vietnam era and got away with not serving because of a bone spur in his ankle, has such an attitude towards use of force and violating the powers, the separation of powers in Washington, D.C. between the three branches, and utilizing the fact that the Republican Party has the majority in the Congress, they have a supermajority in the Supreme Court, and knowing that he's using that instead of using it in restraint for a political agenda that would fit a conservative agenda, but not a radical MAGA agenda. He is destroying the fabric of American constitutional law. And he's basically destroying the fabric of the balance of powers doctrine that James Monroe and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson first created. James Adams, John Adams and James Monroe and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. They came up with that. There was a debate on how to create American government. And John Adams and Jefferson were pretty much the architects. And James Madison was the author of putting their ideas into the Constitution, including the First Amendment. And that has held, for better or worse, for 250 years or more. And it's been the signal democracy in the world, as it was the first modern democracy since Greece and the early Roman Empire. And they were deep thinkers. You might say they were geniuses. They understood political history and philosophy. And as John Adams once said, he studied war and politics so maybe his sons could study theology, art, and music. And those men, those founders, were deep students of political theory of hundreds of years in Europe and understood what they were writing for and against and how they would best create a government that would be handled by the masses of the people, and to avoid the excesses of they saw in Europe and even in the papacy. And so they framed what came to be the form of government that we've had, for better or worse, for many decades and centuries. It wasn't. It was unperfect. It was flawed deeply because of slavery. It was institutionalized. And the beauty, you might say, of American history, while it's sad and deeply disturbing, was almost immediately great souls, individuals, you might say, in a sense, modern saints grew up decrying the constitutional compromise that allowed slavery to exist in the southern states, particularly racism to flourish in some parts of the North. And so immediately you had the abolitionists developing, and by 1820s, 1830s, you had major voices decrying the constitutional compromise with slavery. And they eventually, their vision won out. It took the loss of 600 and some thousand individuals in the Civil War. And yes, Abraham Lincoln lost his life because of the probably our greatest president was Abraham Lincoln. Of course, our American Mussolini, he compares himself to as being the greatest president, and many of his followers consider him the greatest president of all time. Of course, I don't know if they're thinking about history when they say that, or if they're just thinking about the modern presidents. But if they think he's the greatest president of all time, it just shows you where we're at in the country and where his followers' minds are and where they're not. Abraham Lincoln made a statement that in the middle of the Civil War, he writes a letter to a friend, and he says, "We're not fighting this war for the American citizens only." He says, "We're fighting this war because of the first principles of our founding fathers created a political sense of freedom for the first time in modern and human history. And these rights, these constitutional rights, which are God-given, are not just for American citizens, but for all mankind throughout the world." Lincoln understood that if the Union failed, if the cause of the Civil War ended in the dissolution of the Union and the loss of the constitutional sense of freedoms that were given to all men who were created equal, then the democracy experiment that he called it would have failed, and it was basically going to fail throughout the world. And I think it's so telling that Lincoln talked about the rights that Jefferson and John Adams discussed at the birth of this country, that he understood that those rights, what they did in a sense by politically, they put the gospel into political narrative that every man is created equal and created and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, not be from the state, and not rights given by some king or queen or taken away by some emperor or some Mussolini type of figure or Napoleon type of figure or other authoritarian type of figure that we see in the world and we've seen in the world. It seems like our dear blundering, overweight, almost 80-year-old, thick-headed Mussolini, who occupies the Oval Office, somehow doesn't understand. I think he's too thick-brained to understand Thomas Jefferson. He can't understand the Declaration of Independence. He can't relate to it. As many people said who follow him and voted for him, he's a businessman. Businessmen don't care about the Declaration of Independence. They're looking for profit. They don't care if it comes from an authoritarian government like China or Hungary or a strong man, as long as they make a profit. That's what he's in a long line of American CIA directors who promoted the American corporations against democratic elected officials in Latin America and Middle East and Asia, and they undermined them. That's where Trump is very close to the deep state in theory, because he only thinks about money and greed and He thinks making America great means making America rich again for his friends, as we all see. Make America great to him is money oriented, economics. It has nothing to do with the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment or the 14th Amendment or what happened in the Reconstruction era after the Civil War and the great minds that it took to frame the laws and the amendments, the Civil War amendments, or even the great minds that took place in the 50s and 60s that gave a second Reconstruction to this country and ended Jim Crow. He has no comprehension of U.S. history, and that's why him and his Republican leaders today, including those in Columbus, Ohio, are trying to erase American history from the high schools and from colleges. They don't want to teach about the struggle for slavery, at the end of slavery. They don't want to teach about the sin of slavery. They don't want to teach about the struggles to overcome Jim Crow. They call that a negative thing that young minds shouldn't hear about because it makes it, quote unquote, denigrates a certain feeling among certain whites are made, quote unquote, feel guilty because of that history. No one has to feel guilty today. No one today, living today, except for maybe his age and above, we're enforcing segregation in the South. Very few people are alive today that were part of the Jim Crow era, actively participating in that. And if they are, like I met Governor Falbus himself one day in Little Rock, Arkansas. I literally personally made a comment in his presence, and he said, "Yeah, I was the idiot. I was the fool that tried to block black kids from going to school here in Little Rock." And he admitted that he was on the wrong side of history. That's what most people who were alive and did what they did in the South, suppressing and trying to keep the white power structure alive. They knew they were on the wrong side of history and on the wrong side of morality. And most of them come to terms with that. And many, many cities in the South, especially the major cities, have come to terms with that. More so in the way than the northern cities, because they had to deal with it. I'm very aware of that personally, having lived in the South for a while. And so where we're at in this podcast is I want to invite people's comments. If you're a MAGA person, I would invite you to come on and let's try to defend your views of Trump, and let's defend your views of this idiot Mussolini, and let's see what arguments you can put up to suggest that he's the greatest president ever in your lifetime. And let's see what we can talk about, and if we can discuss where we're going as a country. His rating, I heard today, he's got the lowest popularity rating of any president 7 months into his office. There's a good reason for that. He's offended pretty much everybody. He's even upset his own base with the Epstein involvement. We all know he was involved with Epstein, and he can't even be honest about that. But why would you expect him to be honest about that when he can't be honest to Melania about screwing a $3 stripper down in Tallahassee, Florida, or Tampa, Florida, and having to pay her off through Mr. Cohen? How can you act like you're honest when every wife you've cheated on and repeatedly had affairs on them, not just one, or not by mistake or some human failure? You're a serial adulterer, and you didn't even respect Melania. And I don't know how she stayed. I don't hear anybody asking Melania the question they asked Hillary over and over again every time she went out in public: how did you stay with this man? Yet I don't hear anybody asking Melania that question. How can she stay with a man that she knows paid off hundreds of thousands of dollars to several women since he was married to her, and in lawsuits that were brought out in court, and the man that did the paying off went to jail, and for doing so and lying about it to the FBI. So this is an open discussion. I want to add one more thing, which Professor Jeffrey Sachs has just commented on, and he's been commenting on, and other major intellectuals that I have been following for over a year now or more, including Max Blumenthal, the Gray Zone, and Norm Finkelstein, Professor Norm Finkelstein, who's just an absolute, hands down, authoritative mind and genius, you might say. No one has more of a grasp on Palestinian history and the Jewish involvement with Palestine in the past 40 years than Norman Finkelstein, because he devoted his life to it, studying it. And he's written so many books about it. But there are other serious scholars, and I followed, and I'm of Scott Ritter, who is another critical thinker and voice right now at this time in several sectors. And we can talk about the Ukraine-Russian war as we get down the road and what happened there, where Trump's messy foreign policy, he has no strategy. He's just going by the seat of his pants from week to week, month to month. He changes his views, and Putin knows that. And Putin's much, much more savvy than Trump ever could be, having experienced 5 presidents. Trump thinks he can bully or somehow play Putin. It's just act like America is stronger than Russia and China combined. It's kind of silly to think of that way. And but the thing I want to focus on as we go forward in these live streams, I want to hear your discussion about Gaza and how I'd invite my Jewish friends who are pro-Israel and those who are protesting what it means to be a Jewish person, knowing their nation, this gift that they were given in 1948, is committing a mass genocide on par with what Hitler did in spirit to your people. And I'd like to hear what your thoughts about that, because it's so deep and it's such a moral issue of our time to think that we have a mass murderer who comes and gets 25 standing ovations by our Congress. And that says something about the country we're living in and the political framework that we're living in. When the leader of a so-called greatest ally in the United States is starving over 500,000 children presently as we speak, and Trump is doing nothing to stop that, literally nothing to stop the starvation of an entire population, because he sees what his son-in-law sees. He sees the potential for high rises and condos and casinos on the beaches of Gaza. And that's what he sees. He doesn't, and who would want to go to a 20-mile stretch of a beach where hundreds of thousands of people have suffered and died, and over 25,000 children have died in 22 months. And one thing I haven't really heard put across quite like this is just do the math. And I never heard this put in any major media or even on my Palestinian websites or the intellectuals who are talking about Gaza. If you do the math and you put the figure 20,000 children dead, and they have the names, and there's a list that you can go on and you can have them roll in front of your eyes for hours. You can see every single name, starting at infants on up to 14-year-olds. And that roll call goes on for literally over 2 hours on your screen if you want to see it. And it's here on YouTube, and I've seen it on Al Jazeera and other networks. If you take the math of 20,000 children dead in Gaza, and that's probably a modest estimate because we don't know how many are behind the rubble, under the rubble. You divide that by 20 months, you'll see you're talking about 900 children, almost, um, basically 900 to 1,000 children a month have died in Gaza. And you put that in, and you divide that up again, and you'll get the figure of every day how many children have been slaughtered, literally slaughtered by this Israeli government. It makes anything else in the world rather diminished, of least importance. Ukraine, Russia doesn't even begin to approach that number. Um, the dead civilians in Ukraine equals about 1 month of who died in Gaza so far. And so all the medics and the journalists that have died in Gaza in the last 20 months at the hands of direct intentional killings by Israel is the highest number of any conflict since World War II. It might even include World War II. The targeting of journalists, particularly in medics in Gaza, is the highest of any conflict in the 20th century, including up until now. They say, some analysts are saying, you combine all the wars the West has been involved in, and it doesn't equal the number of medics and journalists killed in Gaza by Israel in 22 months. So this president, this Mussolini, he's controlled by the Jewish lobby. He's not his own person. He claims he is. You know, people think he's the greatest president because he's so strong. He's a coward. He's being controlled by Israeli money. He's been controlled by AIPAC and a woman named Allison, Miriam Allison, and I think people know that, and other billionaires, Jewish billionaires that are donors to his campaign and his donor class. They run in his circles. That's who is running our foreign policy. They run our foreign policy. And as Professor Jeffrey Sachs said tonight on Judge Napolitano's show, which is a fantastic show, and I often have watched that almost several times a week for a year, he says he doesn't understand why the American nation and our State Department is so beholden to Israel. Everybody knows it's AIPAC and the money, but he says there's got to be something more. He thinks the Epstein files may explain it, and I think he had a good point. Perhaps all these countries know a little bit more about Trump than the American populace do. And I think they have some very interesting pictures of Donald Trump with young women, and they probably are holding it over his head because those pictures come out and there's no immunity for child rape. I don't care what the Supreme Court says. And that's what Trump really is about. We all know, and even many of the MAGA people know right now, that in their hearts, Donald Trump's a pedophile and a serial pedophile. And this is our president. This is the man that 70 million people voted for. And but he wants to play Mussolini, and he wants to destroy our civil rights. That hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men and women have died. Women have served for and bled for and worked in the factories for and waited for their loved ones to come home, waiting for their sons to come home that never came home. These are the rights that people bled for. And Donald Trump is basically taking a giant dump on them all. And because he believes that God spared him from a bullet over in Butler, Pennsylvania, about 20 miles from where I'm speaking. He thinks God gave him the right to be the American Mussolini. And we'll see. But we can go from there, and we'll see what we do. If there's anybody out there that wants to comment or join, again, I'd like to say again my favorite and my, I'm even to say my most admired podcasts include The Gray Zone, they include Scott Ritter, and they include Judge Napolitano, and I love watching Amy Goodman on Democracy Now! As well. And I shared a stage with Amy Gearman. She may not remember that, but I shared a stage at Kent State University back a few years ago when the students voted for her and I to share the stage on their May 4th celebrations. You make Memorial weekends, which is such a special weekend for them. And of course, honoring those that perished at Kent State. And we'll have to do a show on that and how it relates to modern day Trumpism and the MAGA movement. I want to say one more thing is that I'm not coming from so much a Democratic point of view either. The Democrats Party has, as many know, and as Bernie Sanders has spoken about, and many have, it is decayed from within over the years. I was a lifelong Democrat. My family was lifelong Democrats. My father was a political leader and almost a political genius in Ohio Valley. He rose after he came back from the war. He, like many of his day, he went to school on a GI Bill, became a lawyer, eventually came back to this area, Southern Ohio. He was from West Virginia. And he fought through a very complex era where immigrant Italians' sons, who he was a son of an immigrant Italian, had a hard time breaking through the political juggernaut of the 1950s and early 60s in Eastern Ohio. It was still, they call it blue blood game, you might say. And there were some others, groups that were not really happy with the Italian and influx and some of the Serbian influx and the Russian influx of that era, and especially in Eastern Ohio. And he became, through his talent and through his sheer determination, he broke through and he became the first ethnic individual to occupy a high political position, which was a court. He became the trial judge, a common pleas judge, they call him in Ohio. And in 1970, he was sworn in as the first ethnic in the Ohio Valley to reach that position here because of his qualifications and his hard work as a lawyer and a prosecutor prior to that. And he held that position for 30 years. And through him, the union supported him. He was a strong FDR type of Democrat. Kennedy, he met John Kennedy in 1959 with my mother, supported the Kennedy era. He supported, of course, he thought FDR was like a father figure to him because he came out of the Great Depression, my father did, out of deep West Virginia in poverty. And so he knew the value of unions, and he watched the unions supported my father all of his life, and our family was really attuned to the working class struggles. And my father taught us to respect those, even though most of us, he also put a high value on education. My brother went to law school, I went to law school. My sister became a graduate teacher of history in Connecticut, and my other brother became a computer tech person. But education was highly valued in our family, and like most immigrant families of that era, it was a way to progress and to find the American dream. And we counted among our friends, Senator John Glenn, the astronaut, and other prominent political leader. Jimmy Carter sent my father to China and Korea. He knew Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter came to our town. My father was the host of his dinners, and his nephew stayed in our house. Bill Clinton, my father knew Bill Clinton. I knew Bill Clinton's mother personally, spent an evening with her and was invited to Little Rock or Hart Springs. Unfortunately, we didn't get there. She passed away, but we had a wonderful time. So very well known. My father knew many, many um, Republican and Democratic officials throughout his life, and always stayed true to the old guard Democratic union-based party. Today, that party has shifted, and many see that, and the party has become adherent to the billionaire classes, the elite part of the party, to the donor class. Also, um, it seems like an east-west coast party, as many have said and have described it as, and the Clintons were part of that development. But it's gone beyond the Clintons. It's still there, and in their rhetorical views, they become extreme on certain issues. It's turned off a lot of people, especially in the Midwest. And so the party, but most importantly to me, the party has just lost a moral compass. In some ways, it just has not spoken to the real issues. I will say, I thought Biden was strong towards the unions. I felt he was. And I think he tried real hard to get with the infrastructure bill. He brought a lot of about. People don't give him enough credit for what all these communities, especially in Ohio, Rust Belt areas like ours, that were once former steel towns with tens of thousands of workers. That's all gone. The money that came in from the infrastructure bill and from the ARP bill that many people, blame on the ride for inflation. Many of those Republican, same people who were criticizing Biden's ARP bill and the infrastructure bill, they gladly handed out the funds to their contractor friends to help build the water systems and the piping systems and so many things, the parks and green spaces in these towns that needed it desperately. And they took credit for it. Governor DeWine took credit for all the federal money that was coming through, and he acted like he was giving it out. So it was interesting. Well, Biden I didn't think was good on foreign policy, and I think he made serious mistakes with Netanyahu and Israel, and he maintained those mistakes. He became complicit in that genocide, and I really felt sad about that. I thought on the domestic side, he was at least positive with the EPA and with the labor, and he was strong when it came to fundamental civil rights. So it was a complex thing with Biden, because I really did have a problem with his views on Israel and his support, again, captured by the Israeli lobby, which he was one of the biggest recipients of AIPAC funds his whole career, so he couldn't easily turn away from Netanyahu's slaughter. And his Anthony Blinken was, as Max Blumenthal points out, a major Zionist kid raised by one of the richest Zionists in America, and who could not say no to Netanyahu because Netanyahu was a close personal friend of his stepfather, and Lincoln being a Jewish individual, owed his political life much to the neocon AIPAC wing of the Democratic Party. And so today's Democratic Party seems to have fallen down. They can't even vote for a ceasefire at the DNC meeting last week. And they can't listen to Bernie Sanders, though some are developing and some are coming around to try to stop the flow of arms to Israel. More and more U.S. senators are starting to listen to Bernie Sanders and others who are against the idea of sending weapons to Israel that are killing civilians, or weapons are killing those civilians, destroying the Gaza's infrastructure. Those are American weapons, American-made jets, bombs, missiles, bullets. So, and our technology is supporting them. Planetaire is supporting the assassinations of journalists and medics and spokespersons and EMT workers and police officers in Gaza and humanitarian workers as well. So America is deeply complicit in this, and the Democratic Party is right there in step because of AIPAC, is making sure they toe the line with the mass murderer that leads the cabinet of Israel. And so the Democratic Party in America right now doesn't offer much in terms of opposition to Trump on the greatest moral issue confronting this country. There's many moral issues around the world. There's starvation in Sudan. There's famine in other parts of the world. There's conflicts all over the world. But what makes Gaza and the United States and Israel so unique is that we are directly supporting Israel. At the UN, we block votes against 180 countries to recognize a Palestinian state. At the UN, we block efforts to call for a complete ceasefire, end of all hostilities. We block efforts to send in UN aid workers that know how to feed a population like Gaza. Instead, created a kill zone mercenary group in its place. And we did that with Israel. So the Gazans can be starved and shot while they're trying to get something to eat. And there's only about 8,000 a day out of 2 million people getting anything from the new GAH, they call it, feeding facility. So we are directly involved in this genocide, unlike the Sudan or the other areas of the world that are suffering. And that's what makes it the top moral issue of our times. It's reminds me of Martin Luther King at the end of his life speaking out against the administration that gave him the 65 Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. He actually turned on President Johnson's nice little Vietnam War. And he spoke out very, very strongly, even against his own closest providers' advice, as to why he couldn't remain silent in the latter days of the 60s in this Vietnam War. And his speech given in late 67 was so powerful and so strong about America's role in the purveyor of violence in the world, and how America had squandered its chance to the Great Society to feed the poor, to create housing for the lower income people of America, and to bring about a better society that Kennedy and the Kennedys had conceived of, and King had brought the nation morally to. And we had the money to do it. Instead, it was squandered in Vietnam, as King said. And King eventually came to the point of saying in that speech that he first was a minister of the gospel of the peace, Prince of Peace, which is Jesus Christ. His obligation was to the kingdom of peace. And he says he was a nonviolent proponent in the search for civil rights and ending segregation in the South. And how could he then support a war against yellow people in South Vietnam and North Vietnam? He said that speech, many people believe, marked him for death, for assassination. And it was a powerful speech to this day. And he talks about in that speech the suppression of freedom of speech, and for those who dare to speak out against the war, how they get treated and how they be marginalized and how they can be actually attacked by that then present administration. And of course, we all know King's voice was silenced. In a lot of ways, it was because he was speaking out against the war, as much as it was for his work on desegregating the South and his race relations. So I come to this Martin Luther King's moral witness rose, and his voice could not be silent, he said, during the 60s greatest moral conflict, which was America spending billions and billions of dollars on a war in Southeast Asia we had no business in. And today it speaks the same to us, in that we're spending $22 billion in Israel last year, and over $4 to $6 billion this year. And we got all the political and UN support for Israel. The only one in the whole world is doing that. Not even UK or Australia anymore, or Ireland or Spain or France are even supporting Israel's ongoing starvation. That's all changed. The only major country in the world that's supporting Israel at this point is Trump's administration, despite the American people not supporting Israel's starvation diet for the Gaza 2 million people. So you have a moral issue of the first order happening in this country, and we can't look away. And we're not, if you're a Christian and not a Zionist Christian who thinks Israel's blessed because that's where Jesus is going to come down from heaven one day. And by the way, I am a Christian, and I do believe Jesus one day will return, but nobody knows exactly what's going to happen when he does. And like my father said, do you really want to see the judgment of the world, Richard? Does anybody think the judgment of the world by God is going to be a simple day? The old timers used to fear that day. So many people today think it's just going to be one happy little party. Well, I don't think when Jesus returns to a mass slaughter, it's going to be all that simple. That's not what he taught. And I think there's some people that are going to pay possibly for eternity because of what they're doing right now in Gaza. And one of them just might be the American Mussolini.